All right, well, we're going to be in 1 Peter 3, so go ahead and be turning over there. And my plan is to cover first half of 1 Peter 3 tonight, and we're going to finish this little section on subjection that as I pointed out here in the notes, the reason this is part 1 and part 2 is just because it's the same thread. The same word is used in chapter 2, verse 13, chapter 2, verse 18, there I am, chapter 2, verse 18, and then chapter 3 and verse 1, that word be subject. And so we're tracing how this sense of subjection goes through different areas of life. It's not just for some of us, it's just in different roles that we have to learn subjection. And as we talked about at the end of the class last week, when he talks about this in the slave-master relationship at the end of chapter 2, he compares it to Jesus, where there might be suffering that happens as a result of our relationships that is unfair, but that we can endure suffering trusting that we're following Christ's example. That like Jesus, who left us an example, that he suffered for us, so we can suffer in the different arenas that we're in. That might mean different things in different relationships. We'll talk about that more when we talk about husbands and wives here in a second, because sometimes this passage and this section is used to talk about abuse situations. And I want to say a couple of things about that, because I don't really think that's the topic. But the point being, what we're going to see tonight is just that there will be times when we have to submit ourselves in situations and to people who don't do right and who don't do right by us. And that seems to be Peter's focus, especially as they're preparing to suffer as a result of some wickedness that they're going to have to endure, people going to do wrong things to them. All right, so I'm going to begin just by reading the whole section, verses 1 to 12, 1 Peter 3. It says, "Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless. For to this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. For whoever desires to love life and see good days, let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer, but the face of the Lord is against those who do evil." All right, so I mentioned this already. Peter's been discussing Christians' need for subjection in different relationships. That should be in chapter 2, 13, 17, and 18, because it is not just subjection, but also this word honor that comes up in a couple of places, like in chapter 2, verse 17, honor the emperor, and in chapter 3 and verse 7, husbands, show honor to your wives. All of these are about how we treat people who are in certain roles in relation to us. All right, verse 1 says, "Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct." So he starts with likewise, which means that this is connected. Just like sometimes we submit to emperors or governors, even when they do unfair things, and sometimes, like we talked about last week, in the system of slavery that they lived under in this era, masters and slaves was a reality in the social world, and so some of them had to live under masters, and they had unfair, unjust masters, like he talks about. And so there is subjection that Peter enjoins in that relationship. And so now he says to wives, you're going to do likewise. This thread of submission in occasionally unpleasant situations just seems to run through Christian living. It's just going to be a part of our lives, and we need to embrace that instead of having the natural reaction to push back, or especially as Americans to assert rights and things like that, to instead see that there is something we're being called to here. Okay, it's interesting to me, too, that when Peter talks about these situations, He talks about challenges when we have to submit, when it's hard to submit. It's easy to submit when you agree with everything, right? It's easy. It's nice when the government does everything I want it to do. I'll say, sure, I'm happy to do what you want. But that's not really submission, is it? That's just sort of like agreement. Submission is really tested when we are called on to do something we don't like, or we don't agree with, or we don't think is fair, when there is challenge. So I think that might be why he talks about governors in 2:14, which would be a lot more specific than just emperor, because it's sort of like here where there are things that happen in Washington that might annoy us, but the people we're probably going to deal with are probably a little closer to where we live. And in the same way in the ancient world, they probably had more aversion to governors like Pilate than, say, Augustus Caesar. 2:18, he talks about how slaves also when you're treated unjustly. And here it is when, in verse 1, when your husbands do not obey the word. So wives are to be subject to their husbands even when they do not act as Christian men should. They do not obey the word. We're going to talk about how Christian men should treat their wives in verse 7. But wives do not wait for their husbands to be what they should be before they submit. And vice versa. Husbands do not wait for their wives to be what they should be before they show them honor and treat them with understanding, like we're going to read in verse 7. But I do think this idea of not obeying the word probably means that they are not Christians, that these are people who broadly do not obey the word, not just that they don't obey the word about their role as husbands, but they are not Christians. So you have a believing wife and an unbelieving husband. They're sort of mismatched in the home, and he says, you, even though your husband may not obey the word, you keep submitting to him, you keep being in subject to him. Let me say this, I mentioned this a moment ago, I do not believe that abuse is in mind here. Some people have an interpretation of this passage that would say, essentially, this submission means you just let him do whatever he wants to do to you, and you submit. I don't think that's what Peter is mentioning, talking about. I don't really think that's in the scope of Peter's thinking. And I would just argue this about that. These relationships that we're talking about, our relationship to government, the relationship of slaves to masters, and here husbands and wives, are different. I am not emperor of my wife. I am not master of my wife, and she is my slave. There are differences in these relationships. And because of that, there may be some different implications of that. So, for example, if the government persecuted us for following Jesus, we would have to in some way submit to that, right? I mean, what more can we do? You can't really make the government stop. It's the government. Okay? Whereas I think a situation where a husband would be abusive to his wife is not really what Peter is saying, hey, here in this situation, you need to submit to that kind of abuse. I would consider that to be kind of a different type of situation than what we're discussing. So as we go through this, I want you to kind of hold that out as an exceptional circumstance. That's not really what's in mind here, because I don't think that's what Peter is thinking of. So what I'm getting at is that sometimes what we say about a passage colors our thinking about the passage. And I don't want that to be part of what colors our thinking here, because there is something that is good here that doesn't involve abusive behavior. So his point in verse 1, even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. I want you to think about that, because I think that involves faith and hope. It says, I'm going to live in this way because my husband may be won. But not won because I convince him with all my reasoning and all my preaching, but won because I am behaving as a Christian wife by the respectful and pure conduct of their wives. Even when direct teaching is unsuccessful, he does not obey the word, but he can be won. In fact, I've heard someone argue, and I'm just going to throw this out there for your consideration. I've heard someone argue that no one is won, or being won, no one is ever won, W-O-N, without words. No one is ever convinced of the gospel without words, but people can be won over to the gospel without words. You know, that you can make someone want to obey the gospel even though you never preach to them, just by them seeing how you live. You lay the groundwork for that. And I think that's part of what Peter is implying here with his term, when. Let me just say one more thing about that, and this is kind of a tangent, I'll admit that, but I am intrigued that both Paul and Peter address these kind of mismatched relationships where a Christian is married to a non-Christian. Paul does in 1 Corinthians 7. And they do not encourage, when they're in that situation, they're advising Christians married to an unbeliever, they do not encourage constant harping or focus on the differences, but they both urge, and I'm thinking of this passage too, 1 Corinthians 7:16, they trust that over time, behavior and influence will do their own work. How do you know, Paul says, O husband, whether you will save your wife? How do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Here, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. You can do good in your relationship, even if it's not direct, so that you're not, just constantly badgering him about the differences, but he can see the differences by the way you are respectful and pure. So there's something to think about there, not just for those of us who are in that situation, which is obviously there are going to be some that are in that situation today, but also just as a way of thinking about how we engage with people in the world that we're close to, or maybe that we're in a consistent relationship with. I think of people that we work with, that, when you first try to talk to them about the gospel, you get rebuffed. And yet there is a way that over time you can show an example that wins them over to what you're trying to teach them. So that later on a door may be opened because of the relationship that was not opened just because of the teaching. And I think that's part of what Peter is arguing here. I'm sure you guys have thoughts on that. I'll come back to that when we get done with verse 6. We'll talk about wives. Finish talking about wives. So verse 3, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of the hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. So adorning is a word that describes how we present ourselves to the world, who we are, what we see as valuable about ourselves. And Peter says what's valuable about you should never be your external, your appearance. And he is speaking particularly to women because this seems to be, for one, men tend to evaluate women on the basis of their appearance, and women tend to take their own value, probably because of that fixation of men, tend to take their own value from their appearance. And Peter says that's not what makes you valuable as a child of God. That's not who you are. That's not where your attention should be. You are something more than what you look like. So he says, this is my little paraphrase, don't spend more time arranging your outward appearance. What he says in verse 3, braiding hair, putting on jewelry and clothes. Don't spend more time arranging your outward appearance than cultivating the hidden person of the heart. The kind of person that we are is more attractive than what we look like for now. Because whatever we look like, we only look like it for now. Because after all, he says in verse 4, there is an imperishable beauty, which implies that other beauty is perishable. It's fading. In Proverbs, he says, charm is deceitful and beauty is vain or passing. But a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. So there has to be a priority shift here. Now, I know that Peter is talking to women. I actually think this is a priority shift that has to happen for women and men, because as I mentioned, I think men play into this too, with their fixation on female appearance. But that becomes kind of a chicken or the egg kind of thing, where who started it really doesn't matter as much as it's a problem for all of us, where we end up valuing things that are not valuable. And sometimes we end up saying and doing things that are actually hurtful to our women, because we accentuate things that don't really matter about them, because we focus so much on their appearance. I guess I should give examples of that. Like when an attractive young lady walks into an assembly and all the young men rush and talk to her, and then someone who's maybe not as attractive comes in and no one pays any attention. Or maybe when a young lady is a wonderful Christian person, and people tell her, you really need to work on your appearance. And Christians giving this advice, Christians reacting this way, what does it tell our young women? Other than the opposite of what Peter is saying. It tells them what matters most about you is your appearance, which, as we've said, is perishable. I think we have some work to do here in terms of priorities. And I'll say that cuts both ways in terms of men and women. So Peter talks about a gentle and quiet spirit in verse 4. A gentle and quiet spirit, willing to faithfully serve God and live humbly. I think that's what's intended by quiet. Not just solely concerned about drawing attention to ourselves, not just solely concerned about how other people feel and think about us, validating us, but instead, I'm comfortable serving God. I'm comfortable doing what God wants me to do, even if other people don't think that much of me, because I am valuable to God. It says that in verse 4, which in God's sight is very precious. So, by the way, when you see a phrase like that, that's a phrase to underline and highlight. When God says something matters a lot to him, when God says something is very precious, by the way, that word, very precious, is the same word that Paul uses when he talks about the same thing, and he talks about gold and pearls and costly clothing. That word costly, this is something that's costly to God. This is something that's worthwhile to God. It's valuable to him. So when you see things like that said about God, it should make us sit up and take notice. I think of the time when it says, God loves a cheerful giver. And you hear that and you say, well, God loves this. This is one of God's favorite things. This is something that's very precious to God. It should make us say, then that should be precious to me. I should be pursuing that. Verse 5, for this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. So he alludes back to holy women like Sarah as role models for Christian women today. Sarah obeyed and respected Abraham. This idea in verse 6 of her calling him Lord comes from the text where she calls him Lord or my Lord as she's talking about him. So Peter takes that as a sign of the respect she showed because he is trying to show how ancient women would be respectful of their husbands. Can I just say, though, Sarah's an interesting choice. If you study, and Sarah and I, when we do premarital counseling, we use this passage and we talk about it because Sarah and Abraham's relationship is probably not your first go-to in terms of awesome marriages, just because of the way they are and some of the decisions that they make. So, for example, Abraham makes the decision that they are going to, I know somebody doesn't like me using this term, but I do think that they were at least deceitful in how they said that she was his sister and pretended she wasn't his wife when they go to Egypt. And she ends up in Pharaoh's harem. Okay, that was a bad call, but she did it. She went along with it. But then there are some times where Sarah is, I don't know that I would call her the picture of submission. When she says, Abraham, we need to do something about this. You need to take my servant and sleep with her, and let's just go ahead and bypass all of this and get us some kids in here. And, of course, then when that all works out, and then Sarah is mad about it, and Abraham listens to Sarah. Sarah then says, later on, when Ishmael is mocking Isaac, you got to get her out of here. And Abraham kind of submits to Sarah, right? Abraham sends Hagar and Ishmael away because Sarah asks. You see what I mean? It's a different vision of submission than I think we typically have. You know, we're the one where the man just says this and she just follows along. This is instead more of a partnership and more of a team. And sometimes they make bad decisions as a team, and sometimes they make good decisions as a team, but they work together, and yet Sarah also still has this respectful and deferential attitude toward Abraham. So I think that's a very interesting choice for an example of what this should look like. But I do think there is something here about a willingness to work together to promote what we're doing as a family. We are a team, And certainly there has to be leadership, and certainly somebody has to follow, but at the same time, it is also a part of that kind of leadership and that kind of submission to listen to each other and to consider each other when we make those decisions. All right, let me say one more thing, and then I'll open it up for your comments. He says at the end of verse 6, do good and do not fear. You're her daughters, you're her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that's frightening. I think that's probably referring to suffering that's coming, where everybody's going to be a little bit afraid. And he may just be talking generically. But some have suggested that this may have to do with her husband, who is threatening in some way because of what she's doing to obey the Lord. You know, if we're still in the context of a husband who's not a Christian and a wife who is a Christian, that maybe you keep serving the Lord even though he may treat you poorly as a result of that. I don't know, that's possible. But either way, the one that she fears is to be God and not any man. All right, so I've just said a lot about wives in verses 1 to 6. Any thoughts that you guys have? Said a lot of things. Yeah, Brother Dick?
There's something here that talks to me about our being made in the image of God. And I consider this the notion of being attracted to someone because of a gentle and quiet spirit being a way for me to reflect on why a person wants to be attracted to God. It certainly was walking around on the earth in the person of Jesus Christ, a gentle and quiet spirit. Not that Jesus would pound on the rock and say, you people come over here and be attached to me, but that they saw in him those characteristics. And for those who had a right heart, it was a very attractive thing, a thing that attracted them to him. And I think it's a thing that attracts us to God, that we don't turn our heads to God and line up like 6-year-olds because he thunders in the sky, but because we know in his character that he really wants us to be attracted to him because of his gentleness and his quietness and the way that is attractive to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're drawn to him. We're drawn to that part of his character. I do wonder, too, when we talk about attraction in relationships, often we're talking about a desire to possess something. Instead of it being a connection, we're seeking to fill something in ourselves instead of appreciating the thing for what it is. And God is certainly not that way. We don't possess God in the same way. Instead, there's an admiration there and an aspiration for us. Yeah, Aaron? Aaron Holiday, sorry.
I've sat through over 40 years of lessons on modesty, and most of them start out this way. They say, we're not going to focus on physical appearance. And they start out that way, and then they proceed to focus on physical appearance. In this chapter of Peter says that modesty is a state of mind. It's about your mental state. He says, don't focus on the physical appearance. Instead, here are the qualities of someone who is modestly minded. It's a mental thing. It has a physical application, but it is purely a mental thing. Mm-hmm. It is an attitude.
Right. I don't think we've gotten there in Matt's class yet, but it does talk about propriety, moderation, self-control, which are attitude words. That they certainly have an outgrowth, a manifestation that is described, but the point seems to be the reason we do all those things is because our heart is seeking attention in these physical ways. Yeah.
Don't do this or physical. All we do this
right.
are attitudes.
Right. So I think we have to be able to talk about both dimensions of that, but even if we get the dress code just right, that doesn't mean we've touched the attitude. I think we've all seen that, right? When you talk about school uniforms, you can get the dress code right. It doesn't mean the attitude is there. Yeah. Other Aaron, yes.
So I don't think it's too much of a stretch in verse 1 to also maybe talk about Christian husbands who acutely aren't behaving the way that they should. So there's definitely times where I haven't and don't speak to Kelly the way that I should. And if she reacts in kind, that doesn't necessarily cool things off.
Right.
But on the other hand, if she's more patient and peaceful and loving and kind, then it doesn't take but 15 to 20 minutes after, whatever I might have unkindly said or done for me to reflect on that and marvel and, come back immediately and recognize, just I'm convicted in that way. So I do think that passage can apply acutely as well as chronically. And then I also want to echo what Aaron said. The Bible says a whole lot more about what to wear spiritually than it does not. And you're certainly going that way. And I like the focus on adorning the hidden person. What better adornment than the word? And I like the translation of that word quiet as tranquil. And so I kind of think about the opposite. Someone who does not have that adornment, when they get stressed, then they're frazzled and anxious, and that's not very peaceful, and it certainly isn't very convicting and something that we'd marvel at. But on the other hand, Kelly's ability to be tranquil and calm in the presence of any given situation is something that is something that I would marvel at. So I think, and that comes from the confidence and trust in the Lord in those situations.
Right. I think, too, when you mention tranquil, I'm thinking of there shouldn't be a piece of us that needs other people's attention and approval. And so I think Peter is saying, even there, you'll be fine. A gentle and quiet spirit is comfortable if no one notices. But when people do notice, they're drawn to that. They're attracted to that because that's the way that we all should be. So there is a draw there that I think comes from the peace of it. Jim?
Yeah, the first few verses are intriguing from the standpoint of, men love logos, right? We just want to go to the logic. We're the left brain leaning, I think, generally. We go to the Bible, we go to Acts, and we see these, hey, look, they had one conversation, and the guy wants to be baptized, right? So I think sometimes we look at these stories in the New Testament, particularly of conversion, and we think to ourselves, if I can just lay out a case that is so logical, whether that's in a discussion with my wife or anybody we encounter, then I don't understand why they're not making a decision because I laid it out beautifully, right? But this is speaking more to the, to the pathos, to the emotional aspect of life. And when you really think about it, those relationships at work you mentioned that we have, people see us day in and day out acting a certain way. And we're winning them over without a word in those situations so that at some point we will be able to insert the right words at the right time. And I kind of think that's what Paul meant when he said, I become all things to all people. In other words, I cultivate relationships so that I might save some, so that I might have that opportunity to speak into their lives on, these important topics. So it's an interesting concentration of those thoughts, and I think men in particular just need to kind of get over, it's not a football game that's going to be over in 3 hours and you either won or lost. It may go on forever and you never see what happens. Or does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think it's challenging to think that there might be a relational component to something that is otherwise kind of a logical process. But I think there's something to be said for the emotional side of it. Do you have something, Tunis?
Well, this was more having to do with what Dick said earlier, just the quiet spirit that is precious in the sight of the Lord. And I was thinking, I don't know if it's the same word, but quiet, humble, meek. I once read that the word in Greek was prius, and it's the same word that was used for Alexander the Great's war horses. And so it's more of a submission to power, like under the control of the master. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was a beautiful picture. If we're submitted to the Father, then we'll be submitted in all the other relationships that he says to be submitted to. But it's more than just quiet. It is being at the ready of the master to go and do, what he wants us to do.
Yep. I like that too, because it has the control aspect. It's not a weakness. It's instead that there's, you think about the horses, there's still a power there, but it's just a controlled power. So I like that idea. Jacob?
Yeah, I think that even ties into going back to the example of Sarah. I know you brought it up, and thinking through her example, and you brought up some of the other instances of their relationship. I think a large part of this example ties back to just what's discussed in Hebrews chapter 11, in talking about Abraham's faith and the fact that his faith was pointed out, and that he was basically asked to go where he didn't know. And to go along with that is going to be his partnership with Sarah, who at the same time also does not know what is entail. And so she's trusting and has faith in what Abraham is been instructed and what his decisions are going to be. And she's, as part of that, allowing him to lead and having that submission into understand, what he's going to be deciding here, I'm going to trust in and have faith that it's the right decision as well. And I think that's an important aspect in that submission, is having a trust in your spouse to allow them to lead, to be the role that God's intended, and that shows your faith at the same time.
Right. Although that's challenging, because they're all human, and we're going to make mistakes and poor decisions. But there is a trust there. I also think you mentioned Abraham's faith. Sarah's faith is pointed out in Hebrews 11 too. She has the faith in God, because some of the plan involves her, where she's going to have the child and all of that. But I like what you said, because there's also a trust she has. I know that this guy, he's going to do the right thing as best he can, and I'm going to go along with that. All right. Yes, ma'am. We got one more, and then we need to get verse 7.
This is very weird and just the reverse. We had a couple place membership, and they were quite well off, but you could not have asked for a more sweet, helping woman. I mean, she was there when anybody needed it. She had a spirit. Well, her husband comes to me. One of the weirdest things I was ever asked to do: would you please try to get my wife to go to the beauty shop? And I'm like, oh dear, what do I say? Now, she was very clean. Her hair probably needed some attention. But I couldn't come to say to him, maybe he tried to do that and he didn't do it. But I just told him, I said, Tommy, I'm very sorry. I cannot do that. She is a wonderful, wonderful wife.
Right.
I've never had that. And it was quite the reverse, that he wanted her to look good, which is good to a point.
Right.
So.
That is an awkward situation to be put in. It sounds like you handled it better than I might have, so I don't know what I would say if I were put in that position. But I do think, in terms of this text, there are some things that should matter to us and some that are just less important. And if anything, Christians should be leading the way in understanding and acknowledging that and valuing what should be valued here. I think that's what Peter is pushing toward. All right, let's talk about husbands. Verse 7. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. It's interesting to me, most of the time, when Paul talks to husbands and wives, he talks a lot to husbands and a little bit to wives. Like read Ephesians 5, and you got like 3 verses on wives and like 12 on husbands. Peter does the reverse here. But there's a lot in verse 7. There's a lot of instruction here that I actually think is pretty challenging. Husbands are not told to be subject to their wives. I think we need to say that, because that would be the pattern. Every group that has been addressed since 2:13 has been told to be subject. Be subject, be subject, be subject. But he does not say, husbands, be subject to your wives. Instead, he says, likewise. So just like your wives, you have something you need to do. So I think while the instruction is not the same words, they're not that different. You're going to be doing something that's just like what your wife is going to be doing to you. And that something is a couple of things. First, dwell with them or live with them in an understanding way. Understanding is the idea of not facts, gentlemen, not facts. Not, I know these 18 facts about my wife, but it has to do with personal knowledge or insight into your wife, acknowledging that she is a unique human being, not like anyone else who exists or has ever existed, and that you need to understand her. So if you're going to show love and honor, like we'll talk about in a minute, to your wife, that will have a particular flavor for your wife. And you dwell with her in an understanding way. You try to understand her. I think you can hear in that language that is an effort, that you're going to have to do some work to understand her and to live with her in an understanding or kind or insightful way. Let's talk about the weaker vessel there, showing honor to the woman, he says, as the weaker vessel. That may refer to physical differences. So a wife weaker than a husband. It may simply be a simile, as the weaker vessel. All the versions have that. You treat her as the weaker vessel. Not that she is weaker, but you treat her as if she is weaker. In other words, you're going to treat her gently and carefully and kindly, just like you would something that was weaker, because that's the way you show honor. So I think whatever you say about the specific meaning, which I don't really get that wrapped up in what specifically he means, I think the point we can all agree on, husbands are not to be harsh with their wives. That's it. Don't be harsh. Treat her like a weaker vessel. Whether you think, oh, that means she's weaker, whether you think that means she's weaker, whatever you think. Don't be harsh with her. Honor them. Honor your wives by treating them delicately. I like to think of this as, this is not really, in my judgment, saying that women can't put up with men. It's that women shouldn't have to put up with men, treating them in a harsh way. That's what Peter is saying. By the way, Paul says that over and over again about husbands loving your wives as Christ loved the church. No one ever hated his own flesh, but he nourishes and cherishes it. That you take care of your wife. That you don't provoke your children, and that you don't be harsh with your wives in Colossians 3. Over and over again, the New Testament talks about this because God knows men, and God knows that men sometimes are harsh. And that should not be in Christian homes. So you treat them delicately, you treat them as the weaker vessel, and you show them honor. He also says they are heirs with you of the grace of life. They are not second-class citizens. They are fellow Christians, which now it seems like Peter's thinking of a believer married to a believer, that we're all on the same team. And there's one more part of verse 7 where he says, so that your prayers may not be hindered, which implies that if we treat our wives poorly, we have angered God and jeopardized our relationship with him. He will not listen to your prayers. So I think sometimes we think marriage stuff is kind of not that big a deal. And here is a statement that says, no, it's a big enough deal that God's not going to listen. Down in verse 12, it's going to say, the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. So the ones who are righteous, the Lord's ears are open to their prayers, but his face is against those who do evil. In other words, you become an evildoer when you treat your wife in this harsh way. So immediately, when you read verse 7, you might say that's a small verse, but immediately you know this is not a license for men to just do whatever they want and treat their wives however they want. Not Christian men. And so there is a pattern here of I'm going to show her honor, I'm going to treat her gently, and I'm going to live with her with understanding because I know she is my fellow heir. All right, I need to move quickly because I have less than 5 minutes. Verse 8, finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. This is interesting because it's a little, what do you call this? I don't know, a pyramid, I guess. But it goes up and it goes down where the outer two are similar, unity of mind, and humble mind, the first and the last, they link together. These are pursuits of things that are greater than our own desires. Humility and unity, it's a bigger deal than what I want. I want to be one with you, and I want to even sometimes defer to you. And then the two innermost, the second and the fourth statements here, are sympathy and a tender heart. Sympathy is the idea of I want to feel and experience what you are. And a tender heart, of course, means I'm willing to feel and willing to hurt as you hurt and understand and think about you in an open way. So we're seeking to understand and serve and show love to other people. And so he says, have sympathy, have a tender heart. And then all of it is tied together by brotherly love, which is the affection between Christians that comes because Jesus loves us. So we love each other, and we have a special relationship that is like a sibling relationship. Verse 9, do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless, for to this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. So we're going to suffer. We're going to have hardship. We talked about that. That's what 1 Peter is about. And he says, when other people hurt you, do not repay evil for evil. We bless our aggressors. And when we do that, we obtain a blessing. This is what we're called to. He quotes here in verse 10 to 12 from Psalm 34. And I think you get the text of the blessing. Whoever desires to love life and see good days. That's the blessing. And in verse 12, the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. That's the blessing. So we would love life, see good days, Lord's eyes on us, his ears are open to our prayers. So what do we do to get it? Verse 10, let him keep his tongue from evil, his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. So we receive it by watching our mouths. We receive it by actively doing good instead of evil. And we seek it by seeking peace. Now think about all of those things have a special application in times of suffering. What we say, particularly about other people who are harming us, what we do when we have opportunity to do evil to people, but we choose to do good. We have opportunity to curse, but we choose to bless. And when we seek peace, when we could seek to, in some way, perpetuate the breach in our relationship. So all of that has special application, and Peter calls us to all of that. If you want blessing, then you have to live the way God calls you to live to receive the blessing. All right, so let me rush through these applications, and I think we might have a minute here if anybody has anything else they want to say. First, just to kind of sum up some of what we've talked about, submission, kindness, and humility can win people over to Jesus. I am just impressed by this fact that Peter has a vision that we can win people over. Not just teach them, not just straighten them out, but instead win them over, where over time we earn ourselves a hearing. Please keep this in mind, because this will come up again next week when we talk about being prepared to give a defense, that we earn an audience with the way we respond to the things that go on in our lives. And so here he says, you can win people over to Jesus, even in your home. Both men and women must value and encourage true beauty. I think we've talked about that enough. You know what I'm trying to get at there. Part of the problem is men have to value it, and part of the problem is women have to value it. And so together we encourage that, and I especially think we need to think about how we talk about that with our young people. What are we passing on to them? What are we showing them by the way we speak about them and about others? Wives should respect and submit to their husbands. You have Sarah as an ideal here. And then husbands should understand, honor, and serve their wives. Treat them as the weaker vessel. And the last thing is, we do not take revenge. We bless even our enemies. So that, remember, Peter has said in chapter 2 that we are priests. We are a holy priesthood. And priests were the ones who gave the blessing, particularly the great Aaronic blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine on you. That great blessing, that's now what we are. We are the ones who give a blessing. Even when people come to us cursing, we give blessing to them. This is what God's called us to. All right, that's all I've got. I think we're out of time. But anyway, we'll pick up here in verse 13, Lord willing, next week. And I know it looks like it won't be a long class, but you're wrong, because we've got some really, really complicated things. So we'll talk about that, Lord willing, next week.